I'm Big Don Luka, smoke you like my hookah. Pump fake right, then I step back in illusion. That's a boss move maneuver, billionaire entrepreneur. Mark Cuban on the viewer, put you rookies on a skewer. I stay shitting on you boys like I came up from the sewer. Used to have a lot of dollars, now I got a lot fewer. What you saying to me? I hope you save it for me. I'm about to kill the game, and I put it in my testimony.
Hi, welcome to the Mainstream Mavs podcast. This is your host, Will. I'm joined here by my co-host, Jaren.
What is up, guys?
Today, we are going to be getting into the Mavericks' recent 7-game win streak, how they've been able to hold up amidst a flurry of injuries to key rotational players, of course. It's been a very obscure 7-game win streak for the Mavericks. They have not really looked the best, and their strength of schedule has been very weak, to say the least. But the manner in which they have been able to persist throughout a really injury-riddled stretch has been impressive, to say the absolute least. We also will be getting into specifically, we're kind of going to more so highlight the last 2 games versus the Spurs and the Rockets, because I think to an extent, while the Mavericks were able to pull both of those out, and we see yet another Luka 50-point haymaker against the Rockets, he's obviously just on another playing field right now, having won Player of the Week and Player of the Month.
Yeah.
Kristaps won it in the East, which is the ultimate sort of like juxtaposition or tomfoolery from the NBA, just like whatever sort of weird grammatical term you can use upon what the NBA did with Kristaps winning Player of the Week in the East and Luka winning Player of the Week in the West, you can probably apply in this scenario. But nonetheless, it's been a pretty obscure stretch from the Mavericks recently. In these last 2 games, the Mavericks have basically been able to tread water. And, in that first half versus the Rockets, Luka had a pretty rough outing, and you could kind of tell that his workload started to finally catch up to him to an extent. But we saw his reconciliation in the second half, where he looked basically a lot more like he did in the Spurs game, where he was just dissecting the defense and being able to split double teams, get around the defense on double screens, basically getting into the paint at will in whatever manner he really wanted to. I think that we saw him operate a little more in the mid-range in that Rockets game versus the Spurs game, versus where he was just attacking. Yeah. So you can see the workload starting to catch up to him sometimes when he's settling a little bit more. But his stamina is at an all-time high this season, and he's attacking relentlessly, more so probably than I've ever seen him. So that's quite the revelation in terms of how Doncic has been able to dissect defense and just attack continually. And that's probably been my biggest takeaway over the last 2 games, outside of the Mavericks just being able to tread water no matter what the situation is. Like, that's one characteristic of this team that has kind of stood out to me. Despite how weak the opponent is, and despite how ugly these wins are, and despite the lack of perimeter defense, the Mavericks have been able to really mail it in. And despite, being down 19 or having to hold basically like a 1 or 2 point lead throughout the whole fourth quarter in that San Antonio game, and not let anything slip through the cracks, that much has been impressive to me. This just I guess from more of a mental perspective, their willpower and their sustainability. But, there obviously are a lot of holes, and there's a lot of holes, and there's a lot of, indictments that we can look at upon the Mavericks in terms of, is it fair criticism? You can debate that or not because of how many injuries they have, but there are a lot of indictments upon this team in this 7-game win streak that I don't think would be normally applicable to teams that are on a 7-game win streak. What has been your brief summation of Luka's outing just in these last 2 and amidst this whole win streak? And do you think that this win streak has a certain shelf life after the Mavericks have, done this for 7 games, but there's obviously been a lot of noticeable flaws?
All right, so as the classic Kendrick Perkins quote would be, was Luka's actually in shape this year. Now, we know that he's been in shape all year, but in games like this, where the Rockets, he's shooting 9 threes and really just kind of settling throughout the game, we kind of see where he's able to elevate his game and actually will the Mavericks to win this game down 19 points at one point. And really just through this whole entire 7-game stretch, we've seen him play miraculous, to say the least. I want to say like 3 50-point games, and maybe 5 or 4 of those games he had 40 plus. It's just really indicative of like what his sort of coming into this season, how he's able to change this team. Really, in large part, this 7-game win streak is to him, or to his credit, I should say. Now, through this 7-game win streak, we've had a pretty bad strength of schedule. We're playing teams like the Rockets, the Spurs, but even still, the Mavericks willing away and finding a way to win these games is really important to me. Should we be down 19 against the Rockets? No, but still the Mavericks are able to find a way to come back. And really, I think that's just the most impressive part is Luka and how this team has figured a way to win with 3 of their best defenders out.
No, I completely concur rather. And obviously this organization has been dealing with a lot in terms of injuries and the like. But the common denominator throughout this whole 7-game stretch is Luka Doncic's insanity and wins. So, who knows what the sort of trajectory of this team is. I still don't think that they've found their identity, especially with all their guys out and what have you. But, winning games rather, or at least the fact that they're picking a direction, I think is important to me.
Yeah,
they're winning. They're not just like kind of playing 500 basketball amidst this stretch. They're taking care of business against bad teams. This is a team that has historically not done good against bad teams and has always like failed to close the door. Like even as, early on in the season, we saw this Mavericks team succumb to multiple really bad losses against bad teams where they just couldn't shut the door. They'd leave the door open. Like that Thunder game comes to mind when we were up 16 with like 4 minutes left, of course, and had a historic meltdown. So the fact that they're at least doing something and they're going in a direction, whether it be losing or winning, I think that that's my main positive to take away from this, because the worst place to be in today's NBA is treading water / just perpetually being in that mediocre zone, right? Yeah, so they're at least doing something amidst all this, and that's, I think, what's the most positive thing to come out of this stretch. And we will be getting all into it, dissecting Luka's 50-point game versus Spurs and this latest Mavericks versus Rockets game. And of course, it's the rest of the 7-game win streak overall. But before we do that, here's an ad from our sponsor, Anchor. All right, Jaren. So getting into it, looking at this Spurs game here, the Mavericks lit up 125 points here. Let's go ahead and start with the negatives. What in this game rubbed you the wrong way in terms, whether it be like the Mavericks perimeter defense, some role players having a bad shooting night or inability to step up? What do you think caused this to become just a 1-point game down the stretch for the Mavericks?
Yeah, I think flat out, it comes down to defense. This team, of course, they're hampered through injuries, but I think this is probably the worst game scenario where we've seen defense come into such a big factor. Let's see. I know it was like we even saw Sohan hit a few threes, and he's like an 18% 3-point shooter this year. Yep. Keldon Johnson, he was on fire. That's just Keldon Johnson right there. But we even saw Zach Collins make a few, I'm gonna say, and McDermott. Those bench guys, they came up huge for this squad in San Antonio. They were making a lot of mid-range shots as well. As soon as the Mavericks seemingly kind of picked up on the perimeter defensive side, it just seemed like inside it was collapsing. I know this was the first game that broke Christian Wood's 2-block streak. In large part, the Mavericks, they did figure it out at one point. They figured out how to guard the perimeter, but the Spurs instantly clicked and they were scoring inside. I want to say Trey Jones, all these guys, they got easy buckets inside just because of the Mavericks' lack of, defense in general, whether it was perimeter or defending inside. The Mavericks seemingly have to commit to one of the two if they want any chance at winning a game.
Yeah, as injury riddled as the Mavericks are, they almost just don't have the personnel to be able to hold up sometimes. I think that it's all these defenders on the Mavericks right now have a certain shelf life of how long they can play good defense. You'll see maybe Luka be able to become the second coming of Oscar Robertson in terms of, getting all these steals and getting in every single passing lane and becoming this insane off-ball defender. And then there'll be just a periodic stretch where he's just letting guys get by him on backdoor cuts, and he's failing to close out on guys on the wings. And you can't really blame this team though, just because of the lack of, of their personnel being gone and what have you. But, I saw specifically in this Spurs game, the Mavericks did play some zone and some matchup zone throughout stretches in this game. And one sort of thing I particularly noticed was just the amount of cuts that the Spurs were able to get. I mean, obviously Sohan's kind of a dynamic cutter. That's one of his strong suits, just slashing to the basket and coming off down screens and what have you, just going backdoor. But the Mavericks let him, McDermott, even Keldon Johnson a couple times, like be able to just come off like curls and DHOs and just beeline to the basket with like virtually no resistance. That's, a product of you being behind on your rotations, not being able to, move when your guy doesn't have the ball, and kind of getting lackadaisical at times. Dinwiddie's defense has definitely fallen off in this stretch compared to where it was at the beginning of the season. And, we still see these guys really kind of clutch up and jump passing lanes and, get those, sort of nifty off ball turnovers that they're able to generate for themselves and steals. But I feel like, throughout this 7-game stretch with the Mavericks top 3 defenders being out, and Josh Green, Dorian Finney-Smith, and Maxi Kleber, we're really starting to see how volatile things can shift in terms of if, they let the cracks slip open on one possession defensively, then they're really just not able to patch that wound until they get to the next timeout or something of that nature. Because I'm finding that dribble penetration through whatever team, whether it be in this Houston or the San Antonio game, is leading to a lot more points than it was at other points in the season for this Mavericks team. I mean, I think the Mavericks at one point were like top 5 in defense for like a very sort of little margin there, but I can't imagine that they're anywhere close to that now, because they're only, they just don't have the personnel to be able to patch multiple wounds at a time. I mean, Christian Wood's doing as good of a job as he can as a rim protector. All of his insane block games, he had like 5 blocks against the Rockets, another one, which was insane, just as he did in the second Houston game right before this one. But, that's against a smaller team who has, one big man that they run out who's, despite how offensively skilled he is, I mean, I think it's safe to say he's not like the most insane laterally quick or vertical center in the world in Alperen Şengün. So it's not like, and KPJ and Jalen Green tend to go up with some sort of questionable shots at the rim. Their shot selection and their shot diet is when they get going, they just think that they can make anything in the planet, whether it be a 360 between the legs layup or whatever. So I think Wood definitely benefited from that, and I think he's been doing a good job of being able to guard down when he gets switched on to these smaller guys, and especially with inside like 15 feet. But I mean, I'm still like hesitant to label him a pure rim protector. I know it kind of sounds ludicrous, this, with him having this insane defensive stretch. But I mean, when the Mavericks perimeter defense like truly like funnels guys towards him, an Eric Gordon or, even some of the more unathletic guys on the Rockets were able to finish over him. Right. And, it's more like he's been doing a really good job when switched on to these smaller guys, but it hasn't been like, oh, he's just a standstill, like true drop coverage rim protector where he's going to just use his insane verticality and length to be able to basically stray off any opponents that attack him at the rim. So that's still a prevalent need for this Mavericks team. And we've seen that even in this stretch to a certain degree. It hasn't been the biggest need. Like Wood's done as good as he could, like I said, but it's definitely been a prevalent issue. But obviously even more so than that has been the perimeter defense that, I mean, they just can't seem to string multiple possessions in a row together that are actually good possessions. I mean, even in a game where the Rockets only scored 106, you might look at it at first glance and be like, oh, that's not terrible. But the Mavericks really benefited from some kind of bad shot selection, and that second half, and just a young team kind of starting to rush things in the clutch. The Rockets had, I mean, there were a lot more doors open for them to score a lot more than they did.
No, for sure. One thing that really stuck out to me, at least in the San Antonio game, was, with Christian Wood being on the floor, it, as you alluded to like seconds ago, it really hampers your rim protecting. I know he's had some really high block games, but even still, I wouldn't label Christian Wood as an elite rim protector. Through 3/4 pretty much of that whole game, the Mavericks were sticking with the Spurs in the rebound category. And you could kind of tell, whenever the Mavericks weren't really guarding the perimeter, at least they were sticking with the Spurs in the rebound category. The second they pretty much made an adjustment to kind of commit to perimeter defense, Jakob Poeltl grabs 15.
They were bringing in McKinley Wright, who obviously is a smaller guy. Frank got some good run in that game.
Yeah, he got some actually really good run, but the Spurs out rebounded the Mavericks by 22, and I want to say majority of that margin was pretty much to the whole entire fourth quarter. I know, as you said, McKinley Wright and a lot of smaller guys were in the game, but even still, I mean, the Mavericks have to make commitments, and it's just because of their lack of defensive personnel. Yeah,
and I mean that need can be alleviated if the Mavericks had like another rim protecting center who's also able to effectively box out, just somebody a little bit bigger, because we see when the Mavericks go against these like true 7-footers and like a Jakob Poeltl who's really just able to make his presence known down low in all aspects of the game, even if he's just chilling in the dunker spot all game, or he's just being involved in those pick and rolls with Keldon Johnson, or those little short rolls where he gets his push shot like 10 feet away from the rim. It's still pretty evident that the Mavericks are lacking in that department when, I mean, there's just nothing they can do to, basically try to mend his effect on the game whatsoever. I mean, 19 and 15. I mean, he's a really good player, and he'll have nights like that, of course, but it didn't seem that was more like as much of him going beast mode as it was just like the Mavericks not having the personnel to deal with somebody like that. And I mean, I get to an extent centers of, his category tend to get played out of playoff rotations and what have you. But I mean, the Mavericks are going to face some dynamic big men here soon, especially in this coming stretch, just in sort of all facets of the game, right? We look ahead to Saturday when the Mavericks will be playing the Pelicans. They'll be facing Valanciunas. He's a guy who's probably going to be prevalent in the Pelicans rotation come playoff time regardless, just because of what he is able to do offensively. Even if he, to an extent, obviously has to be this kind of drop coverage standstill guy and doesn't have the ability to switch on the perimeter as much, he's probably going to give them issues in that game. I mean, even with Maxey back, the Mavericks are just still lacking that true rim protector. So that's been evident, I think, in some of these games, even though that hasn't been the biggest need. But, in terms of the perimeter defense, I think the Mavericks maybe had a good perimeter defense pre Josh Green and Dorian Finney-Smith being out. I wouldn't go as far as say it's great. I still think they're like one wing away, or another guy who can effectively guard the opposing team's best point guard, night in, night out. I don't know how much they could use, maybe a little more foot speed, but with these injuries, it's just like you're relying so heavily on Tim Hardaway Jr., Luka Doncic, and Spencer Dinwiddie to like guard the opposing team's best player every night. I mean, Tim Hardaway Jr. was attempting to try and stick Keldon Johnson a lot of that game, and he was just simply shooting over him or getting by him on backdoor cuts. Tim lost him within the flow of the offense if Keldon Johnson had any sort of off-ball movement all game. And it's just a tough ask for those guys. I mean, we've seen these guys play defense time and time again. We know that, particularly with Dinwiddie and Doncic, that, they'll have their sort of like 5-minute stretches where all of a sudden they just look like, the second coming of Marcus Smart for like whatever reason, but that's not something that's consistent with those guys. We have enough evidence, I think, to, be able to label those guys as average to good defenders depending on the night, but it's not, those guys aren't sustainable, like long-term solid defenders like the Mavericks have in Finney-Smith and Green.
Yeah.
And I mean, I just don't know how much more there is to take away regarding this. other than the fact that it's a big personnel issue. And, obviously the Mavericks are dealing with like 2 major injuries right now. They could still probably serve to have one more guy, but there's not much more to really harp on besides, those guys. I'd like them to be less lackadaisical in terms of their defensive effort and try to be a little bit more attentive, because I've noticed them get lost off ball a lot. But I mean, at the end of the day, this comes down to you not having one more guy to fill that void amidst these injuries, and just the fact that those injuries have been persistent throughout this stretch. And, you can see how it's starting to catch up to this team at this point.
Yeah, I figure at least with Tim Hardaway, even with Spencer for that matter, I think Luka gets a pass in this scenario, but with the sort of
because he's been carrying such an offensive load. I would
Yeah,
agree.
exactly. Yeah. But yeah, in the case of Tim Hardaway and Spencer, especially with this stretch of, a lot of our top defenders are out, I would expect them to at least try and pick up the load. But with Tim Hardaway, there's been times where it just doesn't even look like he's on the court. It seems like a 4-on-5 situation at times. Now to Tim's credit, he's still somewhat scoring like this Rockets game, but some games he's just non-existent on both ends of the floor.
No, 100%. And I mean, that's in large part, I feel like that's why, Sohan had 20 points, because the Mavericks were not able to, just stick with him. I mean, he's not even really a dynamic offensive player, but he's a guy who's moving a lot around the perimeter and, trying to knife his way into the paint from different angles, and it ended up working out for him. Not to mention, the fact that Dwight Powell and Bertans have looked really rough as well off the bench. Whatever minutes Davis has got, he seems like he's always behind on his rotations, trailing guys. You kind of expect that. Dwight is fouling quite a bit throughout this stretch. He just has no help on the back line. He does get some minutes with Maxey, which definitely helps him a lot and helps his effectiveness on offense as well, just because of the spacing that it allows. But you can kind of see how, when guys are getting funneled to him, or Dwight's having to switch on to a guy, he's not able to shift his hips to get in front of a guy, nor is he really able to protect the rim in any sort of capacity. He's bringing his arms down a lot when, because he just doesn't have the verticality. Well, not the verticality, but he just doesn't have the length on defense to be able to contest with some of these guys, and he ends up bringing his hands down, and he's been over fouling a lot. And Reggie Bullock, I think, he's the one guy who still is, here out of all those Wings and Kleber that are injured right now, but he's been having a really rough go at it. It seems like he's getting lost in all his pick and roll coverages, and he seems like he's going under on a lot of screens really lazily, and to the point to where, like, the opposing team's point of attack ball handler is able to just blow by him before he even gets a chance.
Yeah.
Things of that nature. And I don't know, that's kind of been disheartening, because I'm not saying that he's solely responsible for any of this and that he should have to carry all of the defensive burden amidst everybody being out, but you'd like to see him kind of maybe try to invigorate some life into this Mavericks defense and, kind of bring a little more fire, probably, being the only kind of like known defender out there. And he's getting lost quite a bit in pick and roll coverages. And it just seems as if he's not really able to stick guys like he was last year to an extent. This has kind of been a problem with him since the beginning of the year. I mean, he's had some decent games, especially when he's shooting the lights out, but in games where his 3-point shooting, even if he's just having an average game, but in games where his 3-point shooting isn't just completely popping off and he's having a great game, his defense just doesn't seem as fiery or as spirited as it was last year. And he's not really being able to stick guys as much.
No, for sure. With his, I don't know how you want to tally it, but absence is what I would call it. Through some of these games, we've seen McKinley Wright, we've seen Frank Ntilikina kind of get actually valuable minutes. And to their credit, I've thought that they've played really well with the role that they're given. But yeah, to Reggie's credit, or not credit, but to Reggie Bullock to add to it, his one-on-one defense has been, I will definitely say it's been better. But like you said, whenever it comes down to the pick and rolls or whatever, his decision-making is just a little lackluster. We even saw, I want to say whenever Sohan made his 3-pointers, I want to say he was going under, which is, honest, like who wouldn't go under on a screen against Sohan where he's at the top of the key. But, even still, Reggie's just
He
making
sagged
bad
off him
decisions.
quite a bit. Like,
Yeah.
I get letting him shoot in that scenario, but there's been a lot of times where he was kind of just him or Tim would let Keldon Johnson shoot over them.
Yeah.
They would let Kevin Porter Jr. I mean, they were just really late to, anytime that they were trying to bring a double on Kevin Porter Jr. or Jalen Green that second half, the Mavericks seemed like really late to try and help on that. Like I said, the Mavericks comeback, I felt like was more of a byproduct of the Rockets kind of just getting ahead of themselves, being a young team and having some poor decision making offensively in terms of their shot diet versus the Mavericks actually like stringing together a bunch of stops to really hamper the Rockets. It kind of seemed more like an escape win versus like, oh, the Mavericks started to run away with this game, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. But those are, obviously some of the negatives defensively. We wanted to start the podcast with that because there obviously are quite a bit of positives here in terms of what the Mavericks have been able to do to sustain throughout this stretch, a stretch where they've been as injury riddled as we said. And I mean, it starts at the top with Luka Doncic and Christian Wood, and Christian Wood's instillment in the starting lineup and how that has, I mean, in a way, I think that's almost like opened up things for Luka to an extent in terms of his individual offensive game too, which I think is an interesting thing we might explore here in a second. But there's been, obviously probably, maybe the best little stretch of Luka Doncic's career right here in these last 5 to 7 games, where he's had 250 plus point games, 160 plus point game. Just obviously having to carry an increased offensive burden with, it sounds weird to say because all the guys that we mentioned that are out, of course, are defensive guys, but I mean, they do carry an offensive burden from the standpoint of how much shots they're eating up. The Mavericks are shooting a lot more threes when all those guys are playing. Those, Josh Green adds some dynamism in terms of what he can do in that second unit, coming off the bench, being able to penetrate and kick and being able, to be used as a short roller. So like there's some different avenues that they're missing offensively with those guys out. And I feel like it's an increased sense of urgency for Luka to carry the offensive load. And I mean, it's very like 2017, 18 Harden-esque where it's just, he just casually is getting like 30 to 40 points, like not even like even on the off night. Like it seems like he hit 39 versus Houston. He had a pretty bad first half. Like it just seemed, I mean, his usage rate is exponentially high right now, but he's somehow, sustaining this amidst how much stamina that takes. What have you really gathered from Doncic's recent stretch of just complete and utter dominance?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I think before this sort of 7-game stretch with Luka, like we for sure took him for granted at times. I think that this 7-game stretch has definitely showed me at least that Luka Doncic might be the most like one of the most elite offensive players of all time. And this Rockets game is really just a good telltale or a really good say of what he's able to do like in just one half of basketball. I want to say at halftime he had like 12 points, and by the end of the game, of course, he finished with 39. And he was just so dominant at getting to the foul line. He finished 18 of 22 in free throw categories, which might be like his best of the season. But yeah, I mean, just how dominant Luka's played, getting inside the paint. Majority of his points, even in the 60-point game, has been coming from inside. He's of course had 2 other 50-point games, and majority of those were coming from inside. You can kind of tell, especially in this Rockets game, that being tired was definitely catching up to him. You could see the stamina sort of, I guess, catching up to him. He's taking some stupid step back threes, as we would see like last year or the year before, where Luka has these tough stretches where he just gets tired, and I can't blame him for that. But Luka was able to quickly like pretty much just, hey, like, okay, let's play basketball, let's win this game. And that's exactly what they did.
I think the most intriguing thing that he's done throughout this stretch is his ability to affect winning in different ways.
Yeah.
This has been a stretch where like, Luka will sort of have stretches where he does different things in terms of, oh, he's shooting really good this week, or he's attacking really good this week, or, he's operating in the mid-range more this week. But it seems like on a game-to-game basis, depending on what's working for him and what's not, he's adjusting accordingly. Like we saw him go more to the mid-range in that Rockets game. And then he came out and was a lot more aggressive in that second half in terms of trying to get to the rim, regardless of the defender was, regardless if he had a really lengthy guy and, Usman Garuba over him or Jabari Smith Jr., he was getting to his spots regardless. And I think in past, I don't think anybody's necessarily been able to stop Luka, but I think Luka definitely mismatch hunts, and he tends to, try to shy away from better defenders at some points if, it means that it can take a little bit of a workload off of him and he can, get to his spots easier, even if it doesn't benefit the Mavericks spacing and, they have to sort throughout 10 seconds just to get the right mismatch. Luka will go to that even early on in the season, but I think throughout this stretch, he hasn't really cared who's in front of him. He is basically like, I'm going to get to my spot. I know how good I am, and we're going to get the shot that I deem applicable. Like if I am, if Tim Hardaway Jr., if the play designed is for him to get a wide open corner three, Luka will force the issue to the very last second if his man hasn't rotated over and make a midair swing pass, even if it just seems completely, improbable or whatever. And just him being able to affect the game throughout different aspects of, his offensive play styles and being able to adjust accordingly, in tandem with, I think, just a absolute, like, for lack of a better term, like not giving up mentality in terms of who's on him. That's, I think, been, that's not the sole reason, but that's definitely, I think, part of the reason amidst his success in this stretch, which has just been, completely insane and unprecedented.
Yeah, I think one, sort of thing that really has stuck out to me through this stretch as well is just been his decision making. And not just the decision making, but pretty much, mid-air decision making.
I mean, I kind of wanted to bring this up, but the Mavericks only had 5 turnovers in that Spurs game. And despite, all these defensive woes that we've mentioned, this Mavericks offense, albeit with like very limited personnel off the bench right now, is hyper efficient anytime Luke is on the floor. I mean, yes, he'll have some games where he has like 4 turnovers or whatever, but he's leading. I mean, I'd be interested to like go to some of these second spectrum stats and just seeing like open looks generated and whatever, but it almost seems as if the Mavericks are getting a like competent shot on every single possession. Like they're not taking a whole bunch of like end of shot clock haymakers or anything. It seems as if like there's being a good shot generated almost every possession when he's on the floor.
Yeah, and it's quite literally because of Luka Doncic. I mean, just his decision making has been insane. I know The Athletic, and I feel like it was Tim Cato wrote it, but they put out an article today, and I haven't gotten the chance to read it yet. But the title of the article was like a step by step of how to stop Luka Doncic, and I'm sure at the end of that article, it's going to be you still can't stop him.
Yeah, no, that's definitely going to be the summation of it at the
end.
Yeah,
but like, yeah, I mean, just this stretch of, I mean, really this whole season for Luka has just been incredible. Of course, the 60-point game sticks out and everything, but man, I mean, this has for sure been the best stretch of Luka's career, and I think this season has been quite. I mean, there's no words to describe it.
No, yeah, 100%. Now that we've talked about the Mavericks' defensive woes amidst this stretch, but we've also talked about how Luka has catalyzed and led the wagon for the Mavericks in this 7-game stretch, and been able to kick it into another gear to essentially lead them to this win streak. Let's talk about some of the other guys on this team. I'm going to save Christian Wood for last because I think he's like the only like true positive throughout every single game in this stretch. A guy who, since getting into the starting lineup, has proven himself to be a capable defender, even at times not like elite, definitely a capable defender, and a guy who's, offensive production on a night out, night in basis is benefits hugely from playing with Luka all the time. I mean, I saw a stat that Andy Bailey posted earlier, I think of the Ringer, I believe, where the on-off numbers with Luka and Wood were just night and day in terms of how effective they are together.
Yeah.
And, so he's a guy that I definitely want to get into because, I mean, I think he's he has to have got 20 points in at least 20 points in almost every single one of these last 7 games. But I want to look at some of the other role players. Obviously, some other guys have had an opportunity to play amidst this stretch, like a McKinley Wright, like a Frank Ntilikina. Just kind of across the board, these last 2 games, and even more so, obviously, this win streak. Let's start with the starters. What have you got from the Tim Hardaway Jr. and Spencer Dinwiddie positions in this recent stretch? Do you think Spencer's creation has fell off a bit, or do you think, or like comes in spurts? I guess that's my question in terms of him. And with Tim, I mean, how much longer do you think his sort of really good shooting night and then really bad shooting night and just perpetual cycle of that, how long do you think that's going to be sustainable?
Yeah, I mean, if the Mavericks want him to work out, it's going to have to be sustainable the whole entire season. But, with that being said, Spencer Dinwiddie, I think sort of his playmaking has been shot in spurts. I forget which game it was where he had 25. I want to say it was that New York game where he had 25, and they were like a really good 25 points. But since then, I don't know. Spencer just
even
hasn't
in that
looked...
New York game, though, I thought a lot of it was
like
off ball. He was just, he got a hot shooting night and he was able to drain a lot of threes. But I mean, even in this Spurs game, I believe he had 11 points and he went 5 for 12 from the field. He just hasn't been as insanely aggressive, particularly from a playmaking perspective. He's still pushing the issue in transition, and he has done a good job like attacking off closeouts and things of that nature. When guys are overzealous, closing out on him, and he's been able to get to the basket for some of that stuff. And obviously in that Houston game down the stretch, he was very timely with that mid-range jump shot that was able to propel the Mavericks to I believe a 3-point lead there in clutch time when he hit that mid-range jump shot and like with about 10.5 seconds left. But overall, I just don't feel like we've been seeing as much offensive creation for him. And I feel like they've been deferring to Luka a little more, which has been surprising in a stretch where they have all these injuries.
Yeah, for sure. Spencer, I like what you said about the transition offense. He's really been the guy that's pushed it. But other than that, I just really haven't seen a whole lot from him.
Yeah, no. What do you think of Reggie's offensive game? I mean, I think he's been shooting better, but outside of that, I still would like for him to take a little bit more. It feels like he is almost like scared to shoot at times if it's not a completely like wide open 3 with nobody within like 5 feet of him. He's had like some 7, like 6, 8-point games, things of that nature. He's been hit some timely 3s, which has been a nice change of pace since earlier this season. He's definitely showed that he can still shoot the ball, of course, but that in tandem with his defense being very inconsistent has definitely not, like, I guess he doesn't hold the same value that he did for me last year. Now, I know he could easily turn this around as he has in years previous, where the turn of the new year really is just the start of something special for him. But what have you been able to surmise from his recent stretch?
Yeah, I mean, I think Reggie, to sum it up, he's finding a way to get it done. We've seen games where he goes, again, 1 of 8 from the 3-point line, and then we've seen games in like this Rocket scenario where he has 8 points on 2 of 6 shooting. I just think, pretty much summing it up, like he's definitely more consistent, and really just through the 7-game stretch, he's really been more consistent. But even still, Reggie, his defensive woes have really hampered the Mavericks, being that he's arguably the top defender on this team, minus maybe Frank or McKinley Wright. But in terms of the starting 5, he's been the top guy. I think you can make an argument for Christian Wood. But regardless, Reggie's had his woes on defense, and it's sort of trickled into offense sometimes. We've seen him miss a lot of open 3s, which has been kind of surprising. I feel like he would make the open ones and miss the contested ones, but it's kind of been like the Tim Hardaway effect, where he will not make an open 3, but he'll make a contested 3. And I mean, Reggie's shot, I definitely will say, like, it looks the same every single time it goes up. It's just sometimes it's off the back iron and sometimes it goes in.
No, very, very true. And I mean, he's had some times where he's gotten in transition, but I mean, I think his one-dimensionality as a player has been a lot more limiting in this stretch because of the Mavericks, like lack of creation and what have you, than we saw it post Dinwiddie trade last year. Like when the Mavericks had all 3 of those guys creating, it's like it led to a lot more open looks for Reggie, it felt like. So, I think, there still is a reason to believe he can turn around, but I mean, he has also at the same time, I think has to be viewed as a tradable asset for the Mavericks because he's just not moving the needle like he once was. But we'll see if he's able to turn around to extent. It's just nothing that makes you, jump out of your seat with him versus like games where he'd have like those like 6 or 7 3-pointer games last year. Like we're not getting any of that. You mentioned that Tim Hardaway Jr., you think that the Mavericks will be able to sustain his up and down play. Do you think like once everybody gets back from injury, like, you can live with the 42-point Tim game and then the 0-point game the next game? I mean, obviously that's hyperbole, but
Yeah.
you get what I'm getting at to an extent. Or do you think that, the Mavericks, this is going to come back to bite them at some point, especially, with Tim's basically hit or miss games. And if it starts to catch up to them in some games where they really need his shooting to come into fruition, do you think that it actually is going to be sustainable?
So I think the Mavericks are, whether or not they're going to like it or like whether or not it has to be sustainable is the thing that I'm trying to get at.
Okay.
Yeah, the Mavericks, they're going to win 99% of the games they play where Tim Hardaway scores 25 plus points on amazing shooting. Now the games where he has 6 points on, 2 of 12 shooting, those are the games that the Mavericks are just going to have to survive. Those are going to have to be the Luka 50-point games. And I hate to say it, but, if Tim Hardaway is, scoring 25 points, like I said, like they're going to win the game. The success is like really driven through Tim Hardaway's success. And I don't like saying that, but pretty much my point getting at is it's going to have to be sustainable if they're not going to trade him.
Yeah, I mean, even in these games where the Mavericks have been able to win with him having stinkers, I mean, it's been against very, very, weak teams, or like in that Knicks game where Luka had like 60 and had to basically do everything, and Tim had a really rough game in that one. It was against a RJ Barrett-less and Jalen Brunson-less Knicks. Like, they're just squeaking away. Like if, when we play Thursday versus the Celtics, they would not be able to get away winning the game unless Tim goes out and scores 25 plus, as you mentioned. What do you think of the kind of flurry of the conglomerate of guys off the bench that have been getting more run in this recent stretch with everybody being out? Let's start with McKinley Wright. Do you think that Jaden Hardy should be getting more run than him? What have you seen from him as he's kind of got like 10 to 20 minutes, kind of depending on the game? He had some, he hasn't necessarily been having some insane offensive workload. He's typically out there with like 2 other creators, like a Luka or a Dinwiddie, but he's been doing a really good job defensively. And, when he's asked to play making spurts, outside of, guys going under him because they know he can't shoot on pick and rolls, he's done about as good of a job as I think we could have hoped. He's steady, he hasn't turned it over much. What have you gathered out of his recent stretch?
Yeah, I like the point of, through this different summation of like guys being out, like he's been honestly like the main defender off the bench minus Frank. Like him and Frank have been the 2 guys off the bench that have really brought a defensive pressure that, to be quite honest, the Mavericks just haven't had all season outside of Josh Green off the bench. Now in the argument of Jaden Hardy and McKinley Wright, I think it kind of just depends on what you need, especially from a winning scenario. The Mavericks, their top 3 defenders are out. McKinley Wright is definitely more of a defensive minded player. So in that scenario, I feel like you just have to play McKinley Wright over him. I know in the Rockets game, he didn't have the most effective game, but in, Spurs and past few games, he's had a really, really like positive effect on the Mavericks. Again, he has to sort of play with the Spencer Dinwiddie and Luka while they're both on the court, but it sort of makes him, I guess, just like irresputable on the offensive end. I know was it the Spurs game where he had like 6 points or something like that, all coming inside the paint. Yeah. Like that was honestly maybe the best game he's had all season. But I've just really liked what I've seen on the defensive end. He's able to pick guys up from pretty much full court.
He can guard guys up to about like that.
Yeah. To
about like 6'5", 6'6". We've seen him like switch on to Keldon Johnson a few times. We saw him have to guard KPJ in that Rockets game. And like, while he, guys can shoot over him. And of course, he's not going to be the perfect defender on really anybody over 6'3". He's still able to use his foot speed and lateral quickness to stay in front of guys and honestly limit them to an extent more so than he should be able to at his height, which has been pretty impressive to me.
Yeah.
Next up, we kind of already glossed over Dwight Powell, his, defensive inabilities, but offensively, I mean, it's kind of just been same old Dwight Powell. Like some games where the pick and roll coverage is good by the opposing team center, he gets, severely limited and doesn't have really too much of an effect on the game versus like games like in the Houston game where Şengün has a hard time. He's more of an undersized center, being able to switch and being able to, be really decisive in terms of going with the big or hedging and coming up top to the ball handler and the screen and roll. We saw a game where Dwight Powell was able to, get to the free throw line a lot, got fouled a lot. So it kind of just operates on a game-to-game basis in terms of his effectiveness. Same with Bertans. Just really matters if he's making his threes or not. And if he's running out in transition a little bit. He didn't really get too much run in the Houston game, but he played a little in that Spurs game. I do want to mention Frank's offensive game. You've talked a little bit about his defense, but obviously didn't really provide too much in the, Rockets game. But did you see anything from the Spurs game where, he had a season tying high 9 points? He had a few times where he pulled up for a mid-range shot, kind of actually operated well in space and used his like offensive intangibles to be able to create a shot, whether it be off, just attacking off a closeout and shooting a mid-range shot, or basically sort of, lounging around until he's able to get to a spot, or, we had a few times where he was able to take some guys off the dribble and get to the rim. Do you think that that's going to be sustainable, or do you think Frank's kind of just benefiting by playing some weaker opponents who aren't as defensively capable, and he's kind of just thrust into this role for the Mavericks amidst all these injuries?
I think definitely on the, dribble side of it, I think that's just a case of playing a weaker opponent. But Frank has also got, these corner threes up. I think if he can start making those at a consistent clip, we'll definitely see his effectiveness more used, especially on offense. But even still, I liked what I saw out of Frank, especially in that San Antonio game. It was just really creative offense, or out of his book, that's really creative. Like you mentioned, he's able to take some guys off the dribble and get to the hole. He's take some mid-range shots. He even got a corner three up, like in clutch time, I want to say. It was like 4 minutes left or something like that. But I've really liked, offensively what I've seen out of him, and defense. I mean, he's been the main guy off the bench.
No, I mean, he's probably been the best defender on this team throughout the stretch, even if he hasn't got the most minutes. Theo Pinson didn't really play in the Spurs game. He played a little in the fourth quarter of that Rockets game. He got a little run because Tim was kind of shaky getting up from the floor off one play.
Yeah.
He came in and hit a three. I think he had like a decent defensive possession, but he still just doesn't have his defense is not good enough for him to sustain his very inconsistent shooting. For him to be on the floor consistently would be my brief summation of if any ever in the camp that he should get more minutes. I think once the Mavericks are able to get some defensive versatility back, that Jaden Hardy might get some more minutes. But I do, I'd like to see him more. I do think McKinley right now probably is the smarter pick, even though, obviously the bias side of me would want Hardy to play over him, if that makes any sense. But yeah, I mean, I think that's a pretty fair descriptor for, everybody outside of Luka in terms of how they play in this stretch. It's just been pretty meh. There have been some guys that have stepped up more so in games offensively than they have in others, but it hasn't been like they've been doing anything to really alleviate a ton of pressure from Luka. And I mean, I don't know if that's more like him feeling like he needs to carry more of the burden, or Jason Kidd feeling that way, but I think he's done a very good job of knowing, the situation with the Mavericks injury woes and, operating accordingly. Lastly, let's get into a Christian Wood stretch. He had 25 points versus the Spurs, 21 points and 5 blocks versus the Rockets. He always seems to play really well against the Rockets. Of course, I think he knows their scheme pretty well, especially, how their offense operates. He's playing, stellar defensively. They're pretty good even defensively in that Spurs game, even though he did kind of like basically outbodied by Pirtle a lot of stretches, particularly in that second half. He still took him out to the perimeter and, used the 3 ball to be able to limit him. But I mean, I just feel like we're seeing a lot less like Wood isolation possessions yet he's scoring more within the offense because of the dynamism with him and Doncic. I think it's really starting to come into fruition just how they're being able to use those two together. Like they're going to those pick and rolls, they're going to those pick and pops almost every possession. And, it's not something to withhold. And I'm glad the Mavericks are finally realizing that this is their, especially in a game, in a stretch where they're so injury riddled, they're realizing that they have to go to something that works most, even if it is easily identifiable. Oh my gosh, even if it is easily identifiable by defenses, and they it might be more predictable against a team that's more switchable and is able to defend better. Like who knows what happens against this, Celtics and this Pelicans game coming up, if we're going to see as much effectiveness, just because the scouting report for the Mavericks right now, I feel like is really easy to read. But I mean, ever since Wood was basically able to insert himself into the starting lineup amidst those injuries, really at the start of this win streak, I think maybe one game before that win streak, again, that first game against Minnesota was the first time he started, I believe.
Yeah. I think, yeah.
We already talked at large about his defense, but what is his offensive output been, in your opinion? Like how effective has it been both with and without Luka?
Christian Wood has been quite, amazing. He's been the two-part to Luka that we've been looking for all season. We saw it at times through Spencer and, even Christian Wood at times, but this has been like the most consistent rate of Christian Wood being the best two guy on the team. I think C Wood's rebounding has been really amazing. He's able to grab a consistent, 2 to 4 offensive rebounds per game, in which some of them he's able to put back up for an easy 2. But nonetheless, I think Christian Wood, just his pick and roll with Luka has been just quite, something that we haven't seen all year. At least used this much all year.
Yeah. It's like better than him and Powell, to be honest.
No, it's been way better than him and Powell. Powell, whenever Maxi's not on the floor, just becomes kind of there, honestly. He's just a backup center, but not even a good backup center at this point in the season. But, Christian Wood, he's been amazing rim rolling. He makes some really good decisions out of the rim rolling, whether it's, going up or passing to a corner three like Reggie or Frank or whoever it is. I just think he's done a really good job of decision making and also knowing, when to pop. He's kind of been a little shaky on the 3-pointers, like just decision making on when to shoot and, when to hold the ball or whatever.
I mean, he has the 5th highest catch and shoot percentage in the league at like 46.5%.
Yeah, okay, I actually did not know that. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I still think it's been a little shaky. It's definitely, I think as he's got more comfortable in the starting lineup, it's definitely shown to be more effective. But even still, we see times where he puts the ball on the floor whenever he should just put up a shot.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, but at large, there are, the occasional kind of possessions where you question where he's going with it, should you be taking this guy off a dribble? But at the end of the day, he's playing a lot less in the non-Luka minutes. And I mean, his isolation possessions are still effective when he's getting mismatches, but in these Luka minutes, we're not really seeing him being able to have to like iron out mismatches as much. He's just able to play as a free kind of spirited roller and pop guy. Yep. And when he does get a mismatch, he's able to take advantage of it by basically just, making a beeline to the hoop and then effectively, like being able to Euro step or just shoot over the top of a smaller guy. And I mean, he's just making everything so much more simplistic and easy for himself in this stretch. And his dynamism with Luka is really starting to get like off the charts. I mean, they just work really well together. I think he's like, honestly, like really elevated himself over Dinwiddie as like the distinguished second best player on this team. And he's really essential. We're going to have a podcast come out in probably a couple of days. There was obviously some Mark Stein stuff that dropped regarding his potential extension or non-extension, what the Mavericks prerogative will be with him going forward past the trade deadline. There's a lot of stuff to get into regarding that we're going to be doing in our mid-season podcast here and after, I guess, the next 3 games, because the Mavericks have 3 more games until they're 41 games into the season. They're at 38 right now. So that's definitely a discussion we're going to be having once we get a chance to do another podcast. That's not just like a regular post-game podcast. So we're excited for that because there's a lot to uncover there and unravel. And we have it all over at our Twitter as well, where you can follow us at mainstream_Mavs on Twitter, where we kind of post all about stuff like that on a day-to-day basis. But, just in terms of this recent stretch, he's played amazing. And, I don't think he's entered like that echelon of like, oh, this is the for sure number 2 guy next to Luka for the coming years. He definitely hasn't I'm not that far on the hype train, but he definitely could serve a role in this team going forward for coming years if he continues to play like this, because this has been a pretty big revelation to see his ascension to the starting lineup and how it's been able to unlock some stuff within his game. Like I know some people on Twitter have been talked about, like he's technically only played like a cumulative like 255 games in his career, even if it's stretched over 7 seasons. Like a lot of that was, buried on the depths of a bench and things like that. Him only getting like a couple minutes when he wasn't even a rotational player back in his Detroit and Milwaukee days. So this has been really fun to watch. And, we're excited to see how he is able to, hold this up throughout the rest of the season. It's been really fun to watch. He's kind of been what we hoped KP would be up to this point now that he's started to get going. So I'm glad the Mavericks are finally starting him. Hopefully it doesn't change going forward. But, I think that there's a lot more to unpack, but I feel like we did a good job unraveling the Mavericks offensive and, defensive dynamics throughout this stretch. And, we're basically just at a stage where we're waiting for everybody to get back before we can really start to see the identity of this team. But I think my summation is that, like I said at the top of the podcast, I'm happy that they're in a direction, that they're winning rather than losing, and that they're doing something. And, while their strength of schedule has been really weak, that doesn't undermine that this has been an impressive stretch amidst how many guys have been out, even if, they're just whittling away at these really bad opponents and getting these like really, they're winning these clutch games because they weren't doing that early on in the season when they had their full roster. So that much definitely shows something for me. But besides that, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up the podcast. We'll be back after the Celtics game tomorrow, a marquee matchup on a Thursday night. That'll be a fun one. 7-game win streak could definitely come to an end, to say the least. But we will catch you guys here in the next one. Like I said, make sure to follow us on @mainstream_Mavs on Twitter. Make sure to subscribe and give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure to like and comment down below if you're listening on the YouTube, and give us a subscription on that if you feel so inclined. We appreciate all you guys that are listening, and we will catch you guys in the next one. Go Mavs. See you later.
Bye-bye.